Okay, so the last time we talked about Greek tragedy and some of the distinguishing characteristics that inform a Greek tragedy. Now, of course, the Greeks not only invented the tragedy, they also invented the comedy. Now, whereas they only had basically one type of tragedy, they had three separate types of comedy, and we're going to talk about each one here and give a brief description of them. Okay, first up we have the Seder Plays. Now, if you remember from last time when we were talking about the city Dionysus and how the playwrights who were taking part in the play competition had to provide 4 different plays. They had to do 3 tragedies and 1 Seder play. So named after the mythological creatures from Greek mythology that were half man, half goat. If you're familiar with things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Mr. Tumnus is an excellent example of a satyr. Because they were mischief-loving forest dwellers, that's why these plays are named after them. So again, they're shorter than the regular tragedies. As it says there, these plays were structured like a Greek tragedy, but parodied the mythical and heroic tales that were treated seriously in tragedies. So you're going to hear the word parody a lot when it comes to Greek tragedy. As it says there, the only completed satyr play that still exists is The Cyclops by Euripides. That's something else that we need to take into account, that everything we know about Greek tragedy and Greek comedy, we're basing it off the limited amount of plays we actually have that have survived. A lot of these plays have been lost to history and to time. So in this instance, this is the only example of a satyr play that we still have. The second form of comedy is what we refer to these days as old comedy, meaning that it's basically the first type of full-length comedy play that has been produced. Eventually, the satyr plays would grow in prominence, and we would start seeing full-length comedies as opposed to just the shorter, more condensed versions. Old comedies, the primary focus of them was making fun of society, politics, or culture. Frequently, its characters were recognizable contemporary personalities. So, if you can imagine the way we make fun of politicians or celebrities in our popular culture now, you know that's not that uncommon. You see it every night on late-night talk shows. There's thousands of YouTube channels dedicated to mocking it. Saturday Night Live has been making fun of public officials and recognizable personalities for years. The thing that you need to be aware of is the difference in intent. Back then, with the Greeks, it was considered a great honor to be the subject of an old comedy parody. In fact, in many instances, if they knew the person that they were going to be making fun of was going to come to the show, they would make sure that they sat them somewhere prominent so that people could see them and know who they were making fun of. This was a big deal. It was considered a great honor. I don't know if you can say that the same with our modern day political parodies. Lastly, we have new comedy, so called because this is a form of comedy that didn't come into prominence towards the end of ancient Greece's reign, right before it would become absorbed into the Roman Empire. So this form of comedy would actually transfer over into the Roman theaters and then would continue on throughout the century. So the Greeks really didn't get into this too much, but it would become the template for things that were going to come later. New comedy is a lot more specific than old comedy. So let's just look at some of these basic points. First off, new comedy was a subtle comedy of manners and well-wrought intrigue, which focused on domestic family situations and life in the cities. So right away we see the difference between this and old comedy, where old comedy was about parodying political figures or rules of the day. New comedy was more interested in family situations, kind of like a sitcom. You see there, new comedy was more realistic. So as opposed to being such large, overblown parody characters, we're starting to deal with more recognizable characters. Typically, a new comedy plot was a romantic plot and can be summarized very simply as boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. So the same plot of any romantic comedy you've ever seen or saw a trailer for. Usually there is a domineering parent figure who tries to come between the young lovers, and romantic complications that are resolved by a sudden dramatic coincidences and discoveries. So, for instance, another man may be trying to marry the young woman, our female lead, and then suddenly it'll turn out that he's her long-lost brother, so of course she can't marry him, she has to marry our young hero. So things like that, sudden coincidences and discovery. Lastly, characters are stock types, such as a domineering parent, romantic young lovers, and comic servants. We are going to come back to the concept of stock characters later on. So right now, just kind of file that one away in your brain, because that is something that we are going to come back to and talk about later down the road. Two final things before we move on from Greek comedy. First off, you remember when we were talking about Greek tragedy, one of the defining elements of that form of drama is that it always had to be about someone higher up in society. It always had to be about a king or a nobleman or something of that type. You would not see a tragedy about a commoner. That was, again, part of the very distinct class structure of Greek society. The Greek comedies, however, were all about the common folk. So please make sure you have that in your head, that is a big distinction between these two forms of drama. Tragedy was about the rich and the powerful. Comedy was about the commoners. Big distinction. Please make sure you remember that. Number two, and this is something we'll talk a little bit more about as we discuss some of these plays. When it came to tragedy, the Greeks liked their tragedies bloody. And we will see examples of that. No violence on stage, but they liked the deaths to be creative. They liked the tragedies to be really tragic. When it came to their comedies, they liked their comedies dirty. Lot of what we would now deem inappropriate material. Very much skewing into that rated PG, rated R areas. They loved raunchy, dirty, college-level humor. Okay? That defined their comedy taste to the best of our knowledge. So that's, again, something we'll talk a little bit more in detail about. Not too much more detail, but we will give you some examples of that as we move on.